It's a good thing that you could not hear me, what I just said before. I was just trying to say in my little Vietnamese that I'm very pleased to be here in Vietnam and to present the findings not only of the 2014 Vietnam Provincial Governance and Public Administration Performance Index, but also the wealth of information that we have collected since 2010 when we started this exercise. I have been preceded by our sponsors, by our supporters in this exercise from the United Nations, from the Vietnam Fatherland Front, from SDC, and from the Ho Chi Minh Academy, and they have already introduced what is PAPI and what PAPI has contributed and how this has been used by many provinces, by many policymakers, by many researchers inside and outside of Vietnam. So in the next 15 minutes, I will try to give you a little bit overview of what are the national trends from 2011 to 2014 at the national level, all Vietnamese provinces together. And this will be follow-up for the more specific details on the provincial scores at this dimensional level by our colleague, Dr. San. I will start with the metaphor of the mirror performance. What is it that PAPI is actually capturing, right? It's capturing structural issues that Vietnamese citizens experience when they interact with local authorities at different levels. There are many surveys in Vietnam, but the uniqueness of PAPI is that this is 100% citizen-centric, citizen-based exercises across all Vietnamese provinces. And we have then to understand what is it that the Vietnamese ordinary citizens experiences with governance and public administration. It's not about trying to improve particular scores, but how the overall experience of the Vietnamese citizens can be enhanced to create a more responsive, a more accountable government system in Vietnam, both at the central but also at the local level. To make the story short, right, last year we reported that PAPI was perhaps the largest governance survey in the world, in Vietnam, and we have collected 13,522 responses only in 2014. That basically brings our total to more than 61,000 Vietnamese citizens. We believe with a great deal of certainty that perhaps this is the largest ever governance survey that keeps growing and giving us a wealth of data and a wealth of information. We have deployed a series of rigorous methodological standards to ensure the robustness of the exercise and, most importantly, the representativeness of the sample, that we are trying to capture that this is really an accurate reflection of the mirror if we could have the funding to interview all Vietnamese citizens. In sum, PAPI seems to be or is the best and most representative nationwide survey on governance and public administration available in Vietnam. What is it telling us in specific? Here is a very quick overview of the national trends from 2011 to 2014. This graph here basically tells us the overall scores for the 6 dimensions that PAPI captures from 2011, 2012, 13, and 14 in each one of the 6 dimensions. As has been mentioned already, participation seems to be the lowest, while issues of public service delivery and public administrative procedures achieve the highest levels of satisfaction experiences from ordinary citizens. Now, what PAPI does is that it tells us a story of what is possible to achieve over time in the Vietnamese context of governance and public administration. It's setting the baseline, right, for future improvements in governance and public administration. We always have aspirations to Vietnam to move to the next stage of development. When we started PAPI in 2011, Vietnam just made its graduation to middle-income countries, where citizen satisfaction have been changing since then in a very fast economic growth process. But PAPI tells us, right, what is the tendency in terms of other non-economic issues in Vietnam. But also, what PAPI reflects is that, it's not enough to look only at the aggregate levels, at the national level. We need to look at the uniqueness of the local governance dynamics in Vietnam, and we are trying to capture in what are the differences between the highest performing province and the lowest performing provinces. And this is what PAPI does, try to identify what are those gaps so we can identify what the province in the highest scoring of participation can teach to the province in the lowest scoring position of participation issues, for example, and then try to move these provinces upwards. If we were going to concentrate only in the mean or the median national level aggregates, we will have a reflection only along the yellow dots in these diagrams. We will not have that representation that it's possible to have further improvements in some areas, and we will not be capturing that there are provinces that really need to have some level of support by the authorities at the central level and also development cooperation agencies. We see trends over time. Best performers are improving, as you can see, in terms of service delivery, which highlights that in Vietnam, the issue of accessibility to public services, has been, wide range across the board. We see a great deal of consistency when it comes to administrative procedures. The difference between the highest scoring and the lowest scoring provinces is the lowest distance in all the dimensions. Basically means most provinces, or all provinces, are applying the regulations or providing those services in a more consistent manner than the other issues, like, for example, control of corruption, when we have the largest differences from one province to another one. It's also interesting that we are trying to understand in what context are Vietnamese experiences being reported to. And last year, attending some of the requests to have more contextual information, we added one question to the survey to try to understand what are the main socioeconomic issues according to the Vietnamese citizens. And we are finding that it's the issues of drug abuse, traffic accidents, and food hygiene and safety, the ones that are reporting the highest levels of importance for Vietnamese citizens, but issues of corruption portrays as one key socioeconomic issue in the mind of ordinary Vietnamese citizens. 1 in 4 citizens, corruption is the most serious socioeconomic issues, and 1 in 5 citizens think that healthcare. These are core government functions, or these are issues that require the government to respond, right? That creates equal access and equal levels of opportunity. And this is the context also is important. We have been reporting that there's a high level of optimism with the economic conditions. No surprise, I guess, from these findings. Vietnam has made a very successful transition from low-income to middle-income countries, and incomes, have been increased. Poverty has been reduced. But again, over time, when we start disaggregating, ethnic minorities seems to be, the group that, reports the least levels of satisfaction, but still at a higher level. What we find interesting, and this is what we are trying, to do when we go to the provinces and have this discussion, is that perhaps this level of optimism does not necessarily translate with higher levels of satisfaction with governance and public administration. And this seems to be one of the key challenges for Vietnam. We are about to conclude a 5-year cycle of government. and we are going to start soon, the next 5 years, how can we use that information to understand what are those experiences that then can leverage in the next stage of policy making and policy implementation in Vietnam. Every year, we have questions about transparency, and in particular about the levels of awareness of citizens of land use plans, one of the major issues debated in Vietnam. Over the year, we have consistently found that there's around 20% of citizens that are only aware of land use plans. We saw a slow reduction from 20 to 16% of awareness to land use plans, but we are trying to dig a little bit deeper in terms of what does it mean, and we are finding that this year, fewer citizens than in the previous 3 years have reported having land taken in 2014 as in the previous year. It's a 50% drop, from 10% to 5%. We find, this is a significant steep, right? And we need to try to identify why is it that in 2014 we have this dramatic change in the responses that we receive. We are also digging, given that the entry into effects of the new land law, what are the type of compensation that citizens are receiving? These 5% less, that are reporting land taken. We find that about 64% of those reporting that their land or their relative's land has been taken has received some level of monetary compensation. So this is a good point, 64% around both themselves or relative or neighbors or others. What we found is that there seems to be a difference between those not receiving compensation. 1 in 4 seems not to be receiving compensation at all for land seized in 2014. We need to understand more what does it mean and what type of policies and how the new implementation of the land law is affecting these responses or these levels of experiences from citizens. Corruption has been mentioned across the board as one of the main issues in Vietnam that is hotly debated. 2013, we saw major institutional changes in the country, series of continuation of the anti-corruption campaign. But when we are asking citizens, we see a constant and perhaps slightly rising agreements with statements, with the perception that corruption exists. Particularly, nearly 1 in 2 Vietnamese citizens will agree or partially agree that if you want to get a job in the public sector, you have to pay some sort of informal payments to get that position. We also see with some level of worriness that treatments in public district hospitals require some level of payments, as well as accessing land use rights, certificates, care at primary schools, construction permits, for instance. It remains a constant problem. We need to evaluate. I think that this year, the next 18 months will be an ideal moment to revisit how effective the anti-corruption law has been and what changes will need to be implemented to really make a change in these vicious systemic issues in Vietnam. In conclusions, I think that there are 4 main findings at the national level that we need to invest more time, more resources, more analysis to support Vietnam in creating a more inclusive and responsive governance and public administration system, not only at the national level, but also at the local level, where citizens have the closest levels of interactions with authority. The first has been highlighted already, the dimension of participation, right? The upcoming elections and the revision of the land law is an ideal opportunity to rethink, what Vietnam can achieve in terms of viable forms of opportunities for participation. Although also the overall drop could be a result of survey conducted from the last election, these issues needs to be discussed more closely. I think that Sammy already addressed that it's not about only elections and the opportunities for participation. in political issues, but also about participation in local level infrastructure development projects. How can we support the governments at those lower levels to have better and more efficient infrastructure investments that Vietnamese can also receive those benefits. Corruption, right, is an issue that continues to pervade nationally and locally. Despite the attention paid during 2013 and in the previous year, we see that, that the results continue to highlight that this is a persistent issue in the mind of the Vietnamese citizens, right? Both from the experience level, but also from the perception point of view in terms of certain practices that are required to address as a matter of priority as Vietnam moves ahead in its development stages. And fourth, land issues. We feel in the team that the coming into effect of the land law last year is an ideal opportunity, again, to set the baseline, to try to understand how the law is really having an impact on this major issue in the mind and in the spirits of the Vietnamese, and how the levels of compensation, it seems to be fair or unfair when citizens have to deal with land seizures or not. And we are starting only to understand for the first time what are those dynamics, what are those trends, what are those characteristics. When we continue this exercise, we will have more and more information in which to base our policy. And perhaps the last, the overall policy conclusion from this exercise is that for the first time, we have consistent data over time, right, on very specific issues that both the government at the central level, at the local level, but also the development partners can use to understand what are the major bottlenecks of the reform process in Vietnam, and what are the major issues that will help move Vietnam to the next stage of its development process. Methodology is an issue that has been discussed many times in the past. And before I give the floor to my colleague San, let me just reiterate what we have tried to implement, especially in this year, to strengthen the reliability of PAPI. We have done a series of checks to confirm these statements that we have mentioned earlier, that PAPI is the most robust methodological survey or citizen-centered survey in the country. We had an external independent midterm review that basically confirmed the contribution that PAPI is making to the understanding of governance and public administration. With the help of Dr. Eddie Maleski, we tried to understand our sampling procedures, right? Whether the sampling that we have used in PAPI will generate any bias according to different alternatives. And for the first time, we have verified statistically that what PAPI does seems to be superior to alternatives in terms of reducing bias to particular districts or not. There was an independent spot check done by the Mekong Development Research Institute, random checking in 20 provinces to make sure that these interviews were conducted according to the training, the protocols that were set in place, and to try to identify whether potential deviation deviate or not from results. And we found that there's no deviation at all in this process. And then we have an independent expert from the Faculty of Statistics of the National Economics University to verify the double data entry process. That basically means we had another person independently from the survey team to re-enter the data and then analyze whether there were some mistakes in the entering or in the coding of the respondents. And we found, right, that the initial data entry is reliable and accurate. We didn't find any major differences between the original data entry and the second data entry. All this is being discussed in the report that you have in your hands. And let me just conclude again, what does this nice cover means, it's the mirror reflection. We are trying to understand how all these different pieces of the dimensions of governance and public administration fall into places at the central and at the local level. And now Dr. Sand will present to us how really each one of these dimensions seems to be shaping the overall experiences of governance and public administration in Vietnam from 2014 onwards. Thank you very much.